There's a kind of quiet that comes after a relationship ends that is different from any other quiet you've ever known. It's not the first week quiet. That one is too loud to be called quiet at all. That one rings in your ears and sits in your chest and follows you from room to room in a house that suddenly feels like it was built for someone else's life. No, I'm talking about the quieter version, the one that arrives later, after the immediate shock has passed and the acute pain has found somewhere to live that isn't quite so close to the surface. The quiet of a Saturday morning when you wake up and lie there for a moment before the day starts, and realize, with this strange flat kind of surprise, that there is no one on the other side of the bed. That the silence around you is not temporary. That it is, at least for now, the actual shape of your life. And in that quiet there are two things. Two feelings that don't seem like they should be able to exist in the same body at the same time, and yet they do. You feel both of them sometimes in the same hour. The first is fear. Not the ordinary manageable fear of getting hurt again, although that's there too, completely understandably. Something deeper than that. The fear that comes specifically from having given yourself to something fully without reservation and having it end. The fear that comes from knowing now, in a way you perhaps didn't know before, exactly what loving someone completely can cost you. The fear that whispers sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes in the middle of a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. I don't know if I can do that again. I genuinely don't know if I have it in me to open up like that a second time, knowing what the bill can look like. And right alongside that fear, not replacing it, not canceling it out, just living there next to it, is longing. Not necessarily longing for that specific person, maybe not even longing for a relationship in the formal sense, but longing for the texture of being known, for the small, almost embarrassingly ordinary intimacies that you didn't know to treasure when they were just Tuesday. The shorthand that only two people who've spent years together develop, the kind of silence that feels like company rather than absence, the specific warmth of knowing that somewhere in the world there is one person who is personally glad that you exist. That longing doesn't disappear because love was painful. It doesn't quiet down because you've promised yourself to be more careful next time. So there you are. Both things at once. The fear that knows what this can cost, and the longing that doesn't care. Not sure how to hold both of them. Not sure whether the right move is to wait longer or try again, or do something differently this time, or simply accept that this in-between is what life looks like for now. If that landed somewhere real in you, if you recognized yourself in that description, then I want to be with you in this today. Really with you in it. Because what I want to talk about on Secure Love Psychology today is not just how to get through the aftermath of heartbreak. There is plenty of content about that. What I want to talk about is something more specific and, I think, more valuable: how to use this time. How to move through the grief and the fear and the confusion in a way that brings you out the other end not just recovered, but genuinely more ready for love than you were before. Not because pain makes you stronger in some automatic, inspirational quote sense, but because you did real, specific, evidence-based work on the patterns and the wounds and the ways of attaching that brought you to where you are. And that work changes things, in ways that actually last. You can love again. I want to say that first, clearly, without hedging. And what we're going to spend this video figuring out together is not whether. It is how. How to step into something new from a foundation that is genuinely different from the one that gave way before. How to be ready in the way that word actually means. Not over it, and not somehow healed in a permanent and final way, but grounded. Self-aware. Standing on something solid. Stay with me. This conversation matters. Before the roadmap, I want to spend some time on a question that I think most people skip right past. Partly because it feels obvious. Partly because sitting with the answer is uncomfortable. But it turns out to be the most important question of all. Why does it matter to do this work before you start dating again? I understand every impulse to the contrary. The one that says the best remedy for heartbreak is a new person. The one that says you've already been through enough. You shouldn't have to earn the right to try again by completing some kind of healing curriculum. The one that says, at 2 a.m, when the loneliness has a particular sharp edge, I just want to feel close to someone again. What is wrong with that? Nothing is wrong with it. Those impulses are human. All of them. And I'm not going to tell you that dating before you're fully healed is a disaster. Partly because fully healed doesn't exist, and partly because connection genuinely can be part of healing in real and positive ways. But here is what the research on attachment keeps showing us. And it matters enough to name directly. We don't walk into new relationships as blank slates. We walk in as everything we have ever learned about love, accumulated over a lifetime. Every significant relationship we have ever been in, especially the ones that shaped us most, has left its imprint on our nervous system, on our most basic, automatic, often unconscious beliefs about what relationships are, what we can expect from them, what our role in them is, what we do when things get hard or frightening or disappointing. The patterns that formed in childhood, anxious, avoidant, disorganized, secure, they don't dissolve when a relationship ends. If anything, a painful ending tends to reinforce them. It adds another piece of evidence to whatever file the nervous system was already keeping. If the nervous system already believed that love is temporary, that people leave, that closeness is a setup for hurt, a major heartbreak adds another exhibit. And the next relationship, stepped into without examination, tends to activate the same patterns. Not because you're broken, and not because your past is your destiny, but because nervous systems are fundamentally pattern recognition systems. They apply what they know to what's in front of them, unless something actively interrupts that. Dr. Sue Johnson, who developed emotionally focused therapy, describes this as attachment programming, the deep, largely automatic set of strategies each of us has for seeking and managing closeness. These strategies were formed before we had words for any of it. They live below the level of deliberate decision-making. And in new relationships, they run in the background like software, shaping how we respond to closeness, how we handle conflict, what we do when we feel scared or invisible or like someone is pulling away, what a partner has to do before our nervous system actually feels safe. The person who moves directly into a new relationship without doing the work doesn't leave their patterns behind. They carry them in. And often, not always, but often enough to be worth naming, they find themselves a year or two in feeling something uncomfortably, disconcertingly familiar. Not the same relationship, but the same shape, the same dynamic, the same painful territory, new address. Because the circumstances changed and the nervous system didn't. This is not a life sentence. I want to be clear about that. The patterns can genuinely change. One of the most hopeful findings in all of attachment science is that the nervous system remains capable of learning new things throughout adulthood, that what researchers call earned security is real and achievable, that people move from insecure to secure attachment patterns all the time through intentional work and different experiences. But that movement requires intention, self-awareness at minimum, the willingness to look honestly at what you're carrying. That is what the 3 phases I'm about to walk you through are designed to support. Not a program with a graduation date. Healing doesn't work on a schedule, and I won't pretend otherwise. But a direction. A way of thinking about this in-between time that turns it from something you're enduring into something that is actively preparing you for what comes next. The first phase, feeling what has to be felt. I want to start here because this is the phase most people work hardest to abbreviate, or avoid entirely, or replace with something else, which is completely understandable. Grief is uncomfortable in a way that is categorically different from most other forms of discomfort. It is not the discomfort of a problem you can solve if you think about it long enough or work at it hard enough. It is the discomfort of a loss that simply has to be absorbed, an experience that asks you to be present in the pain of it, without being able to do anything to make it stop. And the world we live in is not built for that. Everything around us offers an alternative. Scroll a little longer, stay a little busier, eat the thing, drink the thing, download the app. Find someone new who makes you feel something other than what you're currently feeling. And none of those things are catastrophic in the short term. Some degree of relief and distraction is genuinely necessary to survive the early weeks. But grief that gets bypassed doesn't resolve. It relocates, goes underground, it waits, and it surfaces later in new relationships, in emotional responses that seem out of proportion to what triggered them, in the pattern of reaching for closeness and then pulling back for reasons you can't quite explain, in ways that are hard to trace back to their origin because the origin is no longer visible. So, what does actually going through the grief look like in the ordinary days of a real life? It starts with allowing the full reality of what you've lost to be real. And I want to name what those losses actually are, because they're more layered than most people expect. There's the loss of the person. That one arrives first and announces itself most loudly. But underneath it are other losses that come more slowly. The loss of the life you thought you were building. The future that existed in your imagination and now doesn't. The loss of the version of yourself that existed inside that relationship, who you were as that person's partner, the particular shape you had in the world when you were part of that specific we. And eventually, the one that can be the most disorienting of all, the loss of the self-story. The narrative you had about where you were going and who you were becoming that had that relationship woven through it. Losing that requires rebuilding not just a life but a sense of yourself. These losses don't all arrive at once. They come in waves at different times, often when you least expect them. You might feel almost okay for a week, and then hear a song in a grocery store and find yourself in a state you weren't anticipating. That is not regression. That is grief doing what grief does, moving through in its own time on its own schedule, not yours. Grief researcher David Kessler, who spent years working alongside Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, has written about how heartbreak often involves mourning several things simultaneously. The person, the life, the identity, the future. All at once, in layers, in a process that is almost never linear and almost never as quick as the people around you will wish it were. And he said something I think about often. The only way through grief is through it. Not around it. Not over it. Not by finding something else to feel in its place. Through. What does through look like on a Tuesday? It looks like letting yourself feel whatever is actually present, without deciding whether it's the appropriate feeling. Anger at someone you also loved. Relief mixed into genuine devastation. Tenderness for someone who hurt you badly. Missing someone you know wasn't right for you. These contradictions are not signs that something is wrong. They are the texture of real grief. Real grief is almost never clean. It looks like finding containers that can hold the feelings safely. A therapist is the best one. And I want to say that clearly, not as a throwaway suggestion but as a real recommendation. Individual therapy during this phase is one of the most meaningful things you can do for your future relationships. A therapist trained in grief or attachment work can help you process things that are genuinely too large and too layered to integrate entirely alone. A journal, not the curated kind but the raw kind, the kind where you write without editing yourself for any audience. And a friend or two who can hold your story without rushing you through it. Who can sit with you in the mess of it without needing you to be further along than you are. It looks like not putting a timeline on it that comes from somewhere outside yourself. Your neighbor recovered in 6 months. Your colleague was back on the dating apps within the year. Those are their timelines. Your nervous system has its own. Grief takes longer than most people around you will think is reasonable, and it is allowed to. The people who let themselves genuinely grieve, without abbreviating it, without substituting for it, almost always come out the other side with something they didn't have before. Not just relief, though, that too, but a kind of clarity about what the relationship actually was, what it genuinely meant, what it taught them, and what they want going forward. That clarity is not available while you're still inside the unprocessed grief. It only becomes accessible after the second phase, learning to read your own blueprint at some point, and you'll feel it when it starts to happen. The world begins to feel slightly less impossible. You start having whole hours that feel almost normal. You can think about the future without it feeling entirely out of reach. That is the signal that the acute grief has had enough room, and that a different kind of interior work is becoming available to you. This phase is about understanding yourself. Specifically, understanding your attachment style, the particular ways your nervous system has learned, over a lifetime of experience, to respond to closeness, to need, to vulnerability, to conflict, to the threat of being left or of being consumed. The relational operating system that has been quietly running in the background of every significant relationship you've ever been in. Let me say something important about this before I go further. This phase is not about labeling yourself. Attachment styles are not personality types with sharp edges. They're tendencies, they exist on spectrums, and most people carry elements of more than one depending on context and relationship. It's also not about assigning blame. Understanding where your patterns come from is genuinely useful. Using that understanding as a weapon against a parent or a former partner is not. What it is about is building the kind of self-knowledge that makes change actually possible. Because you cannot interrupt a pattern while it's running invisibly. You can only interrupt what you can see clearly enough to name. Anxious attachment. In adult romantic relationships, this tends to feel like an almost constant monitoring of the relationship for signs of trouble. A nervous system that never quite fully relaxes because at some level it is always prepared for the other person to pull away. A pull toward people who are somewhat emotionally unavailable, not consciously, but because the uncertainty they create activates something that feels to the nervous system like intensity, like love. A pattern of getting very close very fast. a tendency to need reassurance frequently, and to feel the anxiety spike sharply when that reassurance isn't forthcoming. And underneath all of it, a fear that is very old. I am too much. I am not enough. Something in the way I love drives people away. If this resonates, think about the pattern across your relationships, not just this last one. The people you've been drawn to, the way you behave when a partner goes quiet for a day, what your body does when you send a message and don't hear back quickly. That's the data. Not a verdict, the data. Avoidant attachment. In adult relationships, this tends to show up as discomfort with too much closeness. Not indifference, that's the misunderstanding. Genuine love that coexists with a nervous system that experiences emotional intimacy as a kind of risk. A tendency to withdraw when things get intense. To feel suffocated by a partner's bids for closeness. To notice, in relationship after relationship, that things go well until they get to a certain depth, and then something in you wants to create distance. An underlying fear that is very old. I am going to be overwhelmed, controlled, consumed, and I cannot trust that another person will be there if I actually need them, so I am safest managing alone. If this resonates, think about what happens in you when a partner says, I need more from you. Think about how you feel in the first weeks of something new, when closeness is accelerating. That's data too. Disorganized or fearful avoidant attachment, the most complex and often the most painful pattern. It develops in early environments where the person who was supposed to be safe was also a source of fear or unpredictability. The result is a self that simultaneously craves closeness and is terrified of it. That may be drawn to relationships that are intense, unstable, painful, because that particular kind of intensity is familiar in the deepest sense. That may have difficulty trusting its own perceptions, because the environment that formed it was not one where things were reliably what they appeared to be. Recognizing your pattern honestly, with curiosity rather than self-criticism, with the same kind of interested, non-judgmental attention you'd give to any complex system you were trying to understand, is the central work of this phase. And looking at your relationship history as a whole, not just this last relationship, helps enormously. What kinds of people have you consistently been drawn to? What happens to you in the early stages of closeness? What are you reaching toward? What are you afraid of? When conflict comes, do you move toward or do you go quiet and away? What have your partners tended to say they needed from you that you found hardest to give? These are not easy questions, but they are clarifying. And clarity is where change begins. The third phase, practicing the person you want to become. This phase is the one that gets the least attention. And in my experience, it's the one that makes the largest difference in what the next relationship actually feels like. The work of this phase is practicing secure behaviors before you need them, before there's a relationship to use them in. In your daily life, in your friendships, in your family relationships, and the relationship you have with yourself, you practice the behaviors that belong to secure attachment. And the reason this matters is straightforward. What you practice consistently becomes who you are. The nervous system learns through repetition, and you can give it a different set of repetitions to learn from. What are these behaviors specifically? Asking directly for what you need. Not hinting. Not testing to see if the other person cares enough to figure it out unasked. Not expressing your needs through complaint or withdrawal, and then waiting to see if the message lands. Simply saying out loud what you are feeling and what would help. I'm feeling anxious today and I could really use some reassurance. I'm overwhelmed and I need some time alone. I miss you. Can we make time to see each other this week? Sounds simple when written out. For most people with insecure attachment histories, it is genuinely one of the hardest things to do, because it requires a level of trust in the other person's response that life has not always justified. Start small. Ask for things in low-stakes situations. From friends, from colleagues. The habit of directness builds the way any habit builds. Through repetition in circumstances where the cost of imperfection is low. Sitting with uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it. This is the practice most directly relevant to anxious attachment. When you send a message and don't hear back quickly and the familiar anxiety begins to rise, that pull to send another message, to check their social media, to rehearse what the silence might mean, the practice is to notice the pull and not act on it. Not to convince yourself you feel fine. Just to wait. To breathe. To let the discomfort be present without letting it make decisions for you. The nervous system learns through this kind of repetition that uncertainty is survivable, that it doesn't require emergency action. that you can feel unsettled and be okay. This is hard for people with anxious patterns. It gets easier. Gradually with practice, but genuinely easier. Staying in the discomfort of conflict without either escalating or disappearing. The capacity to have a difficult conversation, to say something that might not be well received, to hear something that stings, to feel the friction of genuine disagreement, without either becoming so flooded that you lose yourself, or shutting down so completely that the conversation can't continue. This is the middle ground of secure functioning. And like everything else in this phase, it's practiced imperfectly repeatedly with a willingness to come back and try again when you don't get it right. Building a life that is genuinely yours. This one is underestimated and critically important. When a romantic relationship becomes the primary container for a person's identity, meaning, and connection, when it carries that much weight, the fear of losing it becomes proportionally overwhelming. And that fear activates the exact patterns that tend to damage relationships. But a person who brings to a relationship a full life, friendships that genuinely nourish them, work or creative pursuits that matter to them, a sense of self that exists independently of whether they are currently someone's partner, that person is in a fundamentally different position. Not less capable of deep love, more capable of it, because they are bringing a whole person rather than a hollow one. This life building is available to you right now, in the in-between time. In fact, the in-between time is possibly the best time for it. There's no new relationship pulling your attention in competing directions. There's no immediate emotional intensity to navigate. There is just you and the question of what kind of life you want to be building, and the opportunity to actually build it. The therapy, the pattern recognition, the daily practice of secure behaviors, the investment in a life that is meaningfully yours. None of this is a prerequisite you have to complete before you're allowed to love again. It is the work that makes loving again genuinely different. That turns the next relationship into something that isn't just new circumstances running through old patterns. When the readiness starts to come, what to look for at some point, and it tends to announce itself not as a dramatic decision but as a quiet shift in how you feel when you imagine the future, you'll notice that you're open again. Or beginning to be. And when that happens, I want to give you 2 specific things to carry with you. What to look for in a potential partner. And what to pay attention to in yourself when you're around them. The qualities that belong to secure partnership, and why they sometimes feel unfamiliar. One of the ways insecure attachment history works against us is that it makes unhealthy patterns feel comfortable. The person who mirrors the emotional unavailability we grew up around. The relationship that replicates the push-pull intensity our nervous system has come to recognize as love. These feel like home. And the nervous system, as we've discussed, trusts familiarity, even when familiar is not safe. Secure partnership feels different. And because it feels different, it can sometimes feel less exciting in the early stages, less urgent, less like the thing we've been chasing. That is not a sign that it's wrong. That is often a sign that it's right. What does it actually look like? Consistency across time. Not perfection. Nobody is perfect, and consistency doesn't mean constant availability. It means reliability. This person does what they say they'll do. They are recognizably the same person in different contexts, with you and with their friends and with their family. They don't go quiet for a week and then reappear as though nothing happened. The baseline of their presence in your life is stable. The willingness to stay in difficulty. Not the absence of discomfort in hard conversations. Hard conversations are hard, that's built in. But the willingness to stay in them. To say, I'm feeling defensive right now, can we slow down? Rather than shutting down or walking out. To come back to things that got left unresolved. To not treat every conflict as evidence that the relationship is failing. Real curiosity about who you actually are. Not just interest in you as a concept or in the version of you that fits what they're looking for. Actual curiosity, the kind that asks follow-up questions about things you mentioned weeks ago, that remembers the specific details of what you told them, that wants to know about your history and your fears and your evolving sense of yourself. The kind that makes you feel like a person being seen rather than an object being evaluated. Accountability that doesn't collapse. When they get something wrong, and they will, everyone does, can they acknowledge it without turning it into a case for their own defense? Can they say, I handled that badly, and mean it? Can they change something after naming it, rather than just apologizing in the moment and repeating the behavior later? This is the quality that allows a relationship to repair and grow, rather than just cycling through the same damage. Respect for your wholeness and your separateness. They are interested in you without needing to possess you. They have their own friendships and their own interests, and they don't seem to require your participation in everything. They celebrate rather than feel threatened by the parts of your life that don't include them. They give you room to be complicated sometimes, and they don't interpret your complexity as rejection. What to notice, especially when something feels familiar in an uncomfortable way? Intensity that arrives faster than depth does. Someone who within weeks is speaking in the language of the future, who says they've never felt this way, who makes you feel seen in a way that seems almost too complete to be based on actual knowledge of you. This deserves a slower look. Not because it's always a problem, but because genuine connection builds gradually, through the accumulation of real experience. And when intensity outpaces depth, it's worth asking what is actually being reflected back to you, and whether it's really you or a version of you that fits what they need. Words that don't match behavior over time. They say they want something serious and are reliably unavailable. They apologize and then repeat the same thing. They describe themselves one way and act another. Watch what they do across time. Words are the story people tell. Behavior is the data. When the story and the data diverge, trust the data. The feeling of always being slightly off balance around them, of working to get back into their good graces without fully understanding what knocked you out of them, of editing yourself to manage their reactions, of walking carefully without quite knowing why. This is not a relationship that requires work in the healthy sense. This is a relational dynamic that is asking you to make yourself smaller in order to stay in it. And that is not love you are looking for. Dismissiveness of your emotional experience. Someone who responds to you sharing something that hurt with "you're too sensitive," or "you always make things bigger than they are." Someone who seems to find your feelings inconvenient. This person is not able to be the partner you need. That is not a failing in you. It is a fundamental mismatch that more accommodation on your part will not fix. And the one that requires the most honest self-awareness, the pull toward the familiar that you know from your own work, is not healthy for you. If you have anxious patterns, pay attention to whether you're being drawn toward people who are emotionally unavailable, because that particular kind of longing can feel exactly like love even when it is the nervous system replicating the only thing it knows. If you have avoidant patterns, pay attention to what happens in you right at the moment when genuine closeness becomes available, because the retreat that follows might be the old pattern protecting you from something you actually want. On timing, and what ready actually means, I want to say something about when, because I know it's a question living in the back of most people's minds as they listen to this. There is no arrival point called ready. It doesn't exist as a destination. What ready actually is a direction. A movement in a particular direction that you can feel and measure but never finally complete. Being ready looks like being able to think about the previous relationship with some clarity, without being primarily swept up in grief or anger every time. It looks like having genuine self-knowledge about your patterns, not perfect knowledge but enough to name what you're working with. It looks like a life that feels engaged and meaningful outside of romantic partnership, not because you don't want partnership, but because you have built enough of a self that partnership would be something added to something solid rather than the thing holding everything else up. It looks like being able to imagine meeting someone new without the imagination immediately flooding with either desperate hope or impenetrable fear. You'll still feel hope and fear, you're human, and those will always be part of entering something new. But with enough ground under you, they are visitors you can host, not tides that sweep you out to sea. That is what the work of these three phases is building toward. Not the absence of vulnerability. You can't love without vulnerability, and you wouldn't want to, but a secure enough foundation that vulnerability becomes something you can choose. Something you walk into with your eyes open. Not something that happens to you before you've had time to decide. We've been somewhere real together today. And before I let you go, I want to come back to where we started. To the quiet. To the Sunday afternoon of it. To the particular ache of sitting in the aftermath of something that mattered enormously, and not yet being sure what comes next. I want to say something directly to whoever is in that place right now. You are not starting from nothing. I know it can feel that way, like the loss has dismantled something foundational, like what remains is somehow less complete than what existed before. But that is not actually what's true. What's true is that you are starting from here. From everything you have lived through, including the parts that were hard. From everything you now know about yourself, the patterns you can begin to see, the needs you're learning to name, the ways of loving that you are, right now, in this exact period, learning to do differently. We looked at three phases today. the permission to grieve honestly and fully, without rushing past it towards something that feels better faster. The work of understanding your own attachment patterns, not to assign blame or cement yourself into a label, but to build the kind of self-knowledge that makes real change possible. And the daily practice of secure behaviors before the next relationship begins, so that the person who steps into that relationship has actually changed, not just changed their circumstances. And then we looked at what to carry into dating when the time comes. The green flags that belong to genuinely secure partnership: consistency, the capacity for difficult conversations, real and specific curiosity, accountability that actually holds, respect for who you are as a separate and complete person. And the red flags worth slowing down for, especially the ones that feel comfortable rather than alarming, because comfortable and healthy are not always the same thing. You can love again. I believe that completely. Not despite what you've been through, but as someone who has moved through it, who has grieved it, examined it, learned from it, and is stepping forward not from the same ground that gave way, but from something more solid. Something built on genuine self-knowledge and genuine readiness. That is what is waiting on the other side of this work. Tell me in the comments where you are right now in this. Still in the grief? Beginning to understand your patterns? Starting to feel the edges of readiness? Every stage matters. Every place along this road is the right place to be for where you are today. If this video found you at the right moment, if it gave you language for something you've been living through without quite having the words, please pass it to someone who is walking through the same territory. You never know exactly who needs to hear that loving again is not just possible, that it is possible better than before. Subscribe to Secure Love Psychology. Come back next week, because this kind of work, learning to love from a more secure place, learning to choose wisely and show up fully and let yourself be truly known, it's not something you do once and then it's finished. Deepens over time, and you deserve a place to keep deepening it. I'll see you then. Take very good care of yourself. What you are doing right now, the staying with it, the willingness to look honestly at yourself, it is genuinely courageous. And it matters far more than you know.